An annual event in Rockford raising awareness and sparking conversation about the impact of addiction and honoring lives lost to the disease. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us tonight at 6:30. I'm Samantha Soto.
And I'm Anthony Ferretti. In Rockford, an annual drug overdose walk returned for a 12th year at the YMCA of Rock River Valley today.
The walk raises awareness about the impact of addiction and honors the lives lost to the disease. Hundreds of signs lining the Rock River. You see them there, each of them displaying the names of people who died from overdoses. Dozens of families walked the trail, laying flowers and remembering those lost to addiction, including the event's founder and organizer who lost her own brother to overdose.
Paying tribute to them and showing that, it's not something to be ashamed of. To raise the awareness is what brings a lot of people here. Their loved one wasn't just an addict. It wasn't someone that just overdosed. They were a mother, they were a father or a brother, a sister, a best friend.